and Tecogen. We'll try our best to explain this stuff. I get phone calls every single day about the rocker arm, the bolt versus the stud versus whatever other application. So currently we have 4 different rocker arms. We have the GM one, which is a GM large hole, which we're calling A. We have a GM small hole. There's 2 different types, but they both do the same thing in our application. Doesn't matter. The only difference is that the hole is longer for a larger camshaft. Either one of them work for us, but you do notice that they are slightly different shape. But they all 4 rockers have the same ratio of 1.7. We're calling that B. C, we have the origin setup, the factory origin setup. This is what comes on a brand new origin engine. Fixed non-adjustable bolt with the ball, a large hole rocker, which is exactly the same as the GM large hole rocker. The difference is they use shims for their preload during setup. Then we're gonna show you what's available, the 83473 kit. Which is a GM part number, but we believe it's made by somebody else. And what it is, it's all the small hole application. Going back to the A, this is the nut that used to be available from General Motors. If you notice, it's got a taper inside, and this will work just fine on this assembly. The problem with this part is discontinued, and the new nut that replaces it does not have that bevel, which, you know, that's the difference why it doesn't work in this application, because it'll bottom out on the stud before we make the adjustment tight. Over here we're just going to go down the differences between the guide plates, the GM versus the origin, and their interchangeability. So large push rod needs a large guide plate. I've found engines with GM push rods, GM engines with a large guide plate. And what that can do is it'll result in the rocker being able to move side to side, move around, and it'll cause premature wear. 84112 kit, which over the years has changed in the application. This was a good viable option to replace certain parts with this kit, but the difference with the kit is it uses a straight stud, which we see here. It uses the ball, and it uses this, what we call the T-washer, or the top hat. And basically what that's doing is it's taking up the difference from the 9/16 ball. The problem with this system is it'll work fine on a GM with a small ball. It will not work well on an origin, and it definitely does not work on a 502 head on an origin engine. And we're going to show you that today. If we look at the studs, these are all the same part number. They came from the 84112 kit. There's been some changes over the years, and we could see physically that we have more threads on one stud. The taper sometimes changes a little bit when it gets down to the bottom near the nut. And the biggest thing to notice about all of these, whether it's the origin or the GM, is the shoulder. Now that shoulder locates the guide plate on the cylinder head, so it can't be offset. If you don't have good alignment, you wind up with something like this. Okay, these studs, sometimes they come with that shoulder on it, but lately they don't. And if we look at some of these, we can see that this one has somewhat of a shoulder. It's good enough. This one has nothing, and then we actually have one that's in between that sort of has a shoulder, but it's not as big. So those are the parts. We're going to show you how they fit on both a head and a GM 502 head, and we're going to compare the differences. The one thing to take note of is if we have an origin head that needs service, and this is non-adjustable. This valve train is non-adjustable. We could stack shims in it, but you start to run out of room. This would be an option if we were able to swap these two in there. Okay, we're removing the non-adjustable stud, the non-adjustable bolt, and we add this GM stud and nut to this combination. Everything remains the same. We can use the rocker ball, we can use the rocker arm, the push rods, nothing is affected. However, this setup will only work on an origin head. It will not work on a 502. You will run out of room on here, and you won't be opening the valve. So our engine is set up. We have a factory origin head. It's an origin engine, origin head. And on the other side, we have a 932 or 502 GM cylinder head. Now, the first thing to understand is that this pedestal or this landing, this casting, where the assembly would sit, meaning that's where your rocker arm would sit. Both intake and exhaust, versus the origin head versus the 502 head, there's somewhat of 70 thousandths difference in height. It's kind of tricky to measure that with the head on the engine, because there's too many variables. You have an angle here, you have canted valve head, so it's not flat straight across the board. The measurement on the rocker arm, it's pretty understandable. So over here we have a factory origin non-adjustable bolt, rocker, ball. This is how it comes from the factory, with no shims. Most of them don't have any shims. Some of them have many shims. So it's something to keep in mind when you're, if you have to take apart a new engine. The next cylinder has large hole rocker arm with the T washer, which is the 84112 kit with the large hole rocker ball. So basically, it's the origin setup with the adjustable kit, the 84112 T washer, the nut, and the stud. And we'll get into why that's important. Third, we have the small hole rocker ball, which is the 83473 kit, minus the stud. In this application, any kind of stud is going to work for us, provided it's on the right head and there's enough threads to get an adjustment. Now on the other side of the engine, we have the same setup. We have the factory origin non-adjustable without shims. Now this is the 502 head. We have the factory origin non-adjustable shims twice, because we're gonna compare the two after we make some adjustments. And we have a large hole rocker arm with a T washer, which is the factory origin parts, is the rocker arm and the ball, with the 84112 adjustable kit, which gives you the T washer and the nut. Now, we'll start on the other side, the factory origin setup. So if we look, our valves are closed, but this is the correct preload. Yes, it's non-adjustable, okay, but just like an adjustable setup, we would bring the cylinder that we're adjusting to top dead center before torquing these down. Okay, now they have a torque of 25 foot-pounds on the non-adjustable bolt. If you get an engine that requires more preload, the origin factory was adding these shims. The inside diameter is 9/16 to fit over that, the rocker bolt, but the outside diameter can't be more than, it's less than 1 inch. Okay, because this will start to wear on the inside of the rocker arm. If you were just to use that setup, a technician would need to walk around with hundreds of these, and you would have to go cylinder at a time, valve at a time, and you'd have to measure it to make sure that this is okay. These shims vary from 10 to 25 thousandths thick. You know, depending on how many they need, they'll just stack them. Most commonly, it's a 25 thousandths shim. I've seen them up to 75 thousandths, 3 shims on one rocker ball. So that's the factory setup from the Origin, with the Origin head, Origin engine. This is okay. Now, if we have to make any kind of adjustments, if you have to replace the cylinder head, anything that's going to change that geometry, you know, that's going to be a problem. We would have to go to an adjustable setup. So if we turn the motor to where the next set of valves is closed, good. Okay, so now our valves are both closed on the next set, which is the 84112 kit. In this setting, with the Origin block, the Origin head as a direct replacement to the stud, to the bolt versus the stud, this is okay. This will work, okay? But you got to take into consideration where that that T-washer or that top hat is sitting as far as the stud is concerned, because it's very close. So here's the parts in question. This would be the 84112 stud. Then we have the Origin ball, and then this is the T-washer or top hat. What happens here is you could see that the T-washer bottoms out before the ball has a chance to make it any further down the stud. So this is limited to the height of that T-washer. You could tighten it down and not have enough preload on your valve train. But in this application, with a factory Origin head on a factory Origin engine, nothing's been milled or rebuilt or anything at this point, or even if it has, you may be okay to use this. Now, if we could take a look in here, Mike, this is where that relationship happens between these two pieces, the top hat and that taper on the stud, okay? Right in here. Now, if we look at the same setup on the 502 head, let's bring it around and close. These two valves are closed, actually. Factory Origin non-adjustable shims, the same setup that we have over here. The only difference is this is on a 502 head now. Valves are closed. Adjustment, you know, the rocker bolt is all the way down, and we can see we don't have enough preload. It is loose. That's up and down play. It's going to cause a lot of problems if this is not addressed. So in this case, this would need to be shimmed. You would have to take all these shims and go one cylinder at a time and make sure that you're shimming this. Essentially, what's happened here is, because this is taller, where our starting point is taller on the 502 GM head versus the Origin, we've lost that on the push rod. We've made the push rod too short. One way we can do it is to shim it, but if we could get a profile of this relationship between the rocker arm and the valve stem, we want to be in the middle of that valve stem throughout the rotation of the engine. Rod is still too short. The push rod should really be picking that up a little bit more. Okay, so based on that, this would either need a shim, or the right thing to do is put a longer push rod in it. Okay, so now here we'll jump right over to this one with the large hole rocker arm with the 84112 kit. So that's a direct replacement for the fixed bolt. We're putting the adjustable 84112 kit in it with the T-washer. Now, if we take a look at the base of that stud, you could see that the T-washer or the top hat is already contacting the stud. So it's already way too short. Shim is not going to help you. This essentially is because the push rod is too short. Or we have to eliminate that T-washer. We're taking the push rod. What's not in this picture is where that stud is located. So The stud would be located right there, okay? But what we've done with the 502 head is if we've taken this line here, the surface of the cylinder head, and we've moved it down. So, of course, that moves everything on the top. And we could see where our rocker tip should be on our valve stem. But when we've made that change over to the 502, we've essentially shortened the push rod, which is bringing this closer to the edge, to the inside or the top edge of the valve stem. That's going to create inaccurate, inconsistent wear. It's also going to cause problems where it's putting pressure on the lifter. It could cause premature failure on the lifter, which we've seen all of the above. It could cause premature wear on the valve itself, the valve stem, and also on the seal. Okay, so here's some examples. This is a top hat washer. Here's a new one. Here's one that was on a 502 head, and we can see what happened there. Because the 502 head was bottomed out on the stud to begin with, and rotation it caused this to wear down, and it's worn down quite a bit. Here's some other examples, and this is the bottom of the rocker arm. So this would be sitting in here like this, but because the spring has forced the pressure, it's at this point. So everything inside of here has worn out. So that's why we have a groove in here. That's why it's worn down in there. So it's very critical to know that this setup will not work on a 502 head for that reason. Some other alignment issues that we've seen is pretty obvious in this case. This is misalignment to locate the guide plate in the motor. Okay, that's with the shoulder, that's without the shoulder. Okay, so if you have too much play on there, obviously things are not going to be aligned well, and you're going to wind up doing stuff like this. Now you could see on this rocker arm that once it got to a point where it was worn, this edge is starting to wear on the outside of the assembly. This could pop the keepers off of your valve, off your valve spring, and you'll drop a valve into the motor, and it'd be catastrophic if the valve fell off. Okay, to demonstrate the 502 head, we're going to use an adjustable push rod versus the Origin factory push rod. Okay, for demonstration purposes, we're going to coat the valve stem so we can see where the rocker arm is heading. Okay, our rocker bolt is torqued back to spec, and obviously it's loose because our push rod is down. Now, using the adjustable push rod, this is used to check length. Getting better. Okay, but now we can see that we're nice and tight where we were not before, right? That's tight. You want to confirm that? Yeah, and even that just pushed the lifter down. All right, but how's our profile? Yeah, it looks pretty good. Okay, so our profile is looking pretty good.
What are you looking at there?
We're looking at the tip of the rocker where it meets the valve stem. We're looking at this right here. You can see it a lot easier in this picture. We're looking for this relationship, okay? Because if we're too far up, that means our push rod is too short, which is the case on the 502. And if we're too far back, it could mean seat or the installation of the valve and the seat combination. So we're gonna give it 2 rotations. Okay, valve is closed. Pull this back off, Nick. Okay, so if we look at our mark, we're almost right in the middle. I mean, we got to look at the whole travel. So the top of the travel looks like it's right here to me, and the bottom of the travel looks like it's right there. Do you agree or disagree? Okay, so this center, we could see that it's pretty much right in the center, and we did not fine tune it. The only thing we did was by hand, we adjusted this push rod. So then what we would do is we would take this push rod out. You got to remove that nut. Okay, and now let's compare it to the origin push rod.
It's a lot taller.
As far as the question,
The question is, if you're doing the valve adjustment on this and you feel a soft lifter, how would you get your zero lash if the lifter is not pumped up?
okay, so now you've taken it down to zero lash where you have no up and down plane, right? No up and down play, and you've given it a half a turn. Okay, you should be fine. The difference is this lifter is soft, meaning it hasn't built up oil pressure in the hydraulic portion of the lifter, versus the one next to it, which is stiff. We could still push it, but it's not as easy as this one.
Right.
So what I would do, instead of adding more preload, is maybe run the engine, listen to the engine. If you have a valve noise coming from this side of the valve cover, let it run for, get it up to operating temperature, take the valve cover back off and recheck this. This should stiffen up a bit once it builds oil pressure. If it remains soft, no matter what you do, you might have a bad lifter. And it doesn't matter if it's new or used or whatever, it doesn't matter. You could take 16 lifters out of the box, you could put them in an engine, and you could have some that are hard and some that are not. And they haven't even been oiled up yet. So you when doing the valve adjustment, like I always say to you guys, is always push down on the top of the rocker throughout the process. Push on the top of the rocker. And if you feel it soft, you might just want to keep an eye on that one, or double check it after you've gone through the rotation. So if this is my cylinder, if this is cylinder 1, let's just say, and I've gone through the motions of doing the rest of the engine, now maybe I set this one back up and I recheck that again and see what happens.
Okay.
And if you feel it's a problem, run the motor, take the valve cover back off if you're not concerned. Well, with a push rod that's too short, we're not going to get the right compression in the engine. And we've had phone calls before where I put these 502 heads on and I have no compression, or it's not making enough power. The reason is we're taking that lobe from the lift of the camshaft and we've shortened it. So now this valve is not going to open as much as it should to make the power we need. That's why it's important to have this geometry correct. Plus the fact that if it's off, you're going to create wear at this point. You have wear at this point, and then also you see this line which is bowed out. It's putting pressure on the inside of the lifter. This all has to be perfectly aligned for these parts to live happily ever after. This is not supposed to be pushing on the bore. This is supposed to be going straight up and down. Same thing on this angle. We also have a seal that sits in here, and that this whole assembly could get worn out. If this is way far off, like we've seen on the other rocker arm, if this is too far off, what'll happen is we'll push down on this portion of the assembly, and the locks will pop out because this spring is under a lot of tension. That lock will fly out. You'll drop the valve inside the engine, and then it's catastrophic after that. You look at that valve stem. See how it's rounded off? That's no good. It should be nice and square like the one right next to it. That's alignment where too much play. A little bit of play is okay. It's going to rock back and forth on that ball, but this is way excessive. So this could have been a bad valve adjustment, somebody not paying attention when they were adjusting it, or let's see what we got. Let's see what we got.
Shims.
No shims. Look at that valve stem.
Yeah, it's rounded.
It's rounded off.
Yeah, it's rounded off. That thing had a lot.
So yeah, I mean, and look at the rocker arm. Okay, so we just took this apart.
Yeah, makes
Look
sense.
at the rocker arm.
So I had a problem all the time.
That engine had a problem, yeah. I don't know why it was removed. We'd have to check it out, but that thing obviously had a problem.
far as why we're not using the slam down bolt. And I was saying that if you do a head job, what you would have to do is you would have to measure every single cylinder and then put shims in accordingly, which right now in the field we don't have the capability of doing that nor the time. So, and if you shoot a boiler room in the dark, 90 degrees and, you know, under pressure. So that's why we do not use the slam downs, because it's just not worth it. Stuff that's happened in the past is we come across the motor with a slam down setup. The guy doesn't know about the shims because he was never taught, or it was just nobody ever said anything like, hey, that's got slam downs. Now we take the valve train, we put in the valve cover doing a normal head job that we always do. Now he takes that set of valves, puts it in another spot with those shims, or vice versa. And between the head being milled and now the shim's in the wrong location all over, how do you even know that your valve is going to be tight? Or
But not only that, that's a very good point. But if he's replacing the head, how does he know he even needs the shim to begin with?
Exactly.
In the same spot. So there's a lot of variables there that need close attention. So now let me bring up two more things. Number one is, you can stay there, Mike. Number one is the locator of the guide plate, right? So we put this down, we have that shoulder to locate the guide plate. In the event that we're using the stud that doesn't have it, what we've been doing recently, most recently, we don't have the shoulder. We're worried about the tolerance between the push rod and the guide plate, which we've already spoken about. What we've done is we could use this as a tool. We could use a bolt or an old GM stud or anything that has that shoulder as a tool to locate the guide plate. And now take our straight stud. The stud works, right? The only problem with it is it doesn't have the locator. We could go ahead and use this as a tool to locate the guide plate and then put this in and go down the line one at a time, moving this with us to locate the guide plates. That's a safe bet. The other thing to take notice of is make sure that your studs, per whatever engine you're going to be working on, have enough threads to do the job. As we saw on the bench, some of them have different thread lengths, even though it's the same part number. So these are the SBI nuts that we have currently available. They have the taper in the back, so we have full adjustment when it's seated. This is the old style GM nut. Years ago, you were able to take a hammer and a chisel and stake this nut to get some of the tension back in it so it locks in place. The new nut, the SBI nut, cannot handle it. Right out of the box, you have to make sure that it's got good enough tension. Do not use any power tools on this because the heat that it generates is significant. So if this goes on once or twice with a power tool, this nut is junk. The bottom line is this is a one-time use nut. This is not the same nut that we used to get from GM. Okay, this is if you're doing a head job and you're using these nuts, they are one-time use. They go in the garbage.